When we found her, we thought this discovery would change history. And we were right. But not in the way we hoped.
Can you hear it? Is it alive?
Get away from him. Is something going on? We thought we'd found the secret of an ancient civilization, but it was a warning, and now it's awakened.
The Martian dust storm had been unrelenting for 3 days, battering their temporary shelter with gusts that howled like banshees across the red wasteland. Dr. Lila Mandari wiped the sweat from her brow as she knelt in the excavation pit, her oxygen regulator hissing softly in the thin atmosphere. The storms had delayed their work, but now, with the skies clear, her team had resumed the delicate task of unearthing what lay beneath the Martian surface. It was Carter who first spotted the anomaly. His shout over the comms drew everyone's attention to the edge of the site, where a section of ground had collapsed under his weight. Beneath the loose red sand, a structure gleamed faintly. The material was strange, dark and metallic, with a sheen that seemed to shift colors under their floodlights. "Doctor! Mandari!" Carter called, his voice taut with excitement. "You need to see this." Lila scrambled over the uneven terrain, her boots kicking up puffs of red dust. She crouched beside Carter and peered into the exposed chamber. The structure was massive, stretching into shadowy depths that their lights couldn't penetrate. Intricate patterns covered the surface, like veins or circuitry etched into the metal. "It's not natural," Lila murmured, her voice trembling. "This isn't just geology." Her heart pounded as the team descended into the opening, their suits brushing against the cool, alien walls. The interior was even more astonishing. The chamber was cavernous, its walls adorned with glyphs that pulsed faintly, as though alive. The patterns reminded Lila of ancient Earth languages, though none she could immediately recognize. "Are we looking at a Martian civilization?" Tess, the team's engineer, whispered. "How old do you think this is?" Hassan Kyle, their linguist, stepped closer to the wall, running a gloved hand over the carvings. "If I didn't know better, I'd say these symbols predate humanity. But they're familiar somehow, like they're imprinted in my memory." The room's centerpiece drew their collective gaze, a circular artifact nearly 2 meters across, resting on a pedestal. Its surface was grotesque, resembling a fleshy, organic material interwoven with metallic veins that glimmered faintly. The artifact seemed to breathe, its surface expanding and contracting in slow, rhythmic pulses. Lila's instincts screamed caution, but Carter was already approaching the object. "Carter, wait," she said sharply, but he waved her off. "I'm just looking," he replied. "It's incredible. What could power something like this after all this time?" Before Lila could stop him, Carter reached out. His gloved hand brushed the artifact, and the effect was instantaneous. A surge of heat and light radiated outward, slamming into them like a shock wave. Lila was thrown back, her vision swimming as her suit's systems scrambled to compensate. When the world steadied again, she heard the low hum. It started softly, like the murmur of distant machinery, but it grew louder, resonating through the chamber. Lila's eyes darted to the walls, where the glyphs now glowed fiercely, their patterns shifting and pulsating in time with the artifact. "What the hell is happening?" Tess shouted, her voice distorted by the comms. The hum grew into a deep, bone-shaking vibration. Lila's head snapped toward the walls as something moved, a rippling motion, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced. The walls, which she had thought were solid, seemed to writhe like flesh under a thin layer of skin. Veins of light coursed through the surface, converging toward the artifact. "We need to leave," Lila yelled, scrambling to her feet. "Everyone, back to the surface now." As they retreated, the chamber seemed to awaken fully. The temperature dropped abruptly, their breaths fogging inside their helmets. The air felt charged, the hum now a deafening roar that reverberated in their bones. Behind them, the artifact pulsed faster, its rhythm erratic and frenzied. A faint crackle of static broke over their comms, followed by a sound none of them would forget. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They burst onto the surface, gasping for breath as the sun dipped below the horizon. For a moment, the world was silent except for their ragged breathing. Then faintly they heard it again, the hum still resonating from deep below, carrying a promise of something stirring in the dark, something alive. The base's walls seemed to press closer that night, their once familiar hum now a menacing undertone. Dr. Lila Mandari paced the small common area, her mind racing with the events of the day. The artifact had done something, triggered some kind of reaction they didn't understand. The glowing glyphs, the strange vibrations, the heat wave that had coursed through them all. It was unlike anything she had ever encountered. Carter sat at the table, his head in his hands. His face was pale, and he'd been unusually quiet since they returned from the tomb. "I think I'm just tired," he mumbled when Lila pressed him. Still, she couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her. By midnight, the first incident occurred. The base's automated systems faltered, alarms blaring as the oxygen filtration unit shut down momentarily. Tess, cursing under her breath, scrambled to reboot the system. "It's not supposed to fail," she muttered. "Everything was running fine before." "Before the artifact," Hassan interjected. His words hung in the air like a challenge. No one responded. Carter's condition worsened as the hours dragged on. He complained of an unbearable heat coursing through his veins, even as the base's temperature controls read a steady 22 degrees Celsius. By morning, dark lines had begun to spread across his forearm, where his glove had torn the day before. Lila examined the marks, her stomach knotting at the sight. The lines were jagged and unnatural, almost like veins turned black with ink. "We need to quarantine him," Lila said firmly. "This could be biological, some kind of infection from the artifact." Carter laughed weakly. "Quarantine me? What if it's already too late for that?" It wasn't a joke. Hours later, Carter collapsed in the middle of the lab. His body convulsed violently, his screams reverberating through the base. The team rushed to restrain him, but his strength was inhuman, his limbs jerking in ways that defied anatomy. Lila could only watch in horror as his flesh began to ripple, bulging and contorting as though something beneath the surface was fighting to escape. "Hold him down," Tess shouted, panic cracking her voice. But Carter's body was no longer his own. His eyes rolled back, his jaw unhinging with a sickening crack. Then, with a final guttural scream, his torso split open, spilling a spray of blood and sinew that coated the room. From within the remains, a grotesque shape emerged. It stood nearly twice the height of a human, its form a grotesque amalgamation of limbs, sinewy flesh, and glistening bone. Its head was vaguely human, but the eyes, glowing and hollow, were anything but. It let out a shriek that pierced their ears, then moved, skittering on too many legs toward the nearest vent. "Seal the base," Lila shouted, her voice breaking. "Now!" Tess scrambled to the controls, locking the external doors and sealing the interior sections. But the creature was fast, disappearing into the labyrinth of vents before they could stop it. The team stood in stunned silence, their suits and faces spattered with Carter's blood. The room smelled of iron and death. Lila felt bile rise in her throat, but she forced it down, turning to Hassan and Tess. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice shaking. "It's loose in the base. We have to contain it, or kill it." "What about Carter?" Hassan asked weakly, his eyes darting to the blood-slick floor. Lila hesitated. "That wasn't Carter anymore," she said, though the words felt hollow. "It was something else." The base creaked ominously, the sound of metal expanding and contracting in the thin Martian air. Somewhere in the vents, they heard the faint scrape of claws on metal, followed by a low, guttural growl. The creature wasn't just hiding, it was hunting. Lila grabbed a portable scanner and motioned for the others to follow. "We have to track it," she said. "If we don't stop this thing now, we're all dead." As they moved through the corridors, the base felt alien, every shadow and flicker of light a potential threat. The creature seemed to anticipate their movements, staying just out of reach, but never far. Its growls grew louder, more guttural, resonating through the vents like a predator savoring its prey. They reached the storage bay, where the tomb's artifact sat on a workbench. Its surface pulsed faintly, glowing with the same eerie rhythm as before. Lila felt a chill crawl down her spine. The artifact was connected to this nightmare, she was certain of it. "What if the artifact isn't just a device?" she murmured aloud. "What if it's alive?" Tess stared at her, wide-eyed. "Alive? Are you saying this thing?" Her words were cut off by a deafening crash. The creature burst through the vent above them, its twisted form silhouetted in the harsh light. It screamed, a sound that pierced their skulls and left them paralyzed with terror. Lila barely had time to react before the creature lunged. The silence after the attack was deafening. The creature had retreated into the shadows again, leaving only the chaos in its wake. Shattered equipment, blood splatters, and the distant echo of its guttural growls. Leela Mandari's hands trembled as she tightened the strap on her oxygen mask. She couldn't stop thinking about Carter, what he had become, and what that creature might do if it reached the surface. "It's not just an infection," she whispered to herself, pacing in the lab as Tess worked to patch the torn bulkhead the creature had smashed through. "It's a transformation, an evolution." Tess looked up from her work, her face pale but resolute. "We need to figure out how it spreads. Carter was the only one exposed to the artifact directly, right? We didn't touch it. Hassan, sitting in the corner with his head in his hands, muttered, "We didn't have to touch it. That thing, whatever it released, it's in the air. It's everywhere." The weight of his words settled over them like a shroud. Lila glanced at her arm, where her suit had been punctured by a shard of debris during the earlier attack. She hadn't noticed before, but now the skin around the tear felt off. It wasn't painful, not exactly, but it tingled as though something beneath the surface was moving. "Check yourselves," she said, her voice tight. "For cuts, for anything unusual." Hassan reluctantly peeled back his glove to reveal a series of black, jagged lines creeping up his wrist. Tess swore under her breath, pulling up her sleeve to reveal small, pulsing nodules just beneath the skin of her forearm. Lila's own inspection revealed a faint discoloration spreading outward from her wound. "It's inside us," Tess said, her voice trembling. "It's already started." Panic swelled in Lila's chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Listen to me," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever this is, it's trying to change us. But Carter, he didn't lose control all at once. We still have time." "Time for what?" Hassan snapped, his voice edged with desperation. "To turn into one of those things? To end up like Carter?" "No," Lila said, gripping his arm. "To stop it. To figure out how it works and stop it before it consumes us." But even as she spoke, her mind raced with doubts. How could they stop something they barely understood? And what if it was already too late? Hours passed in tense silence as the team worked to gather data. The infection wasn't like anything they'd ever seen. It wasn't a virus or bacteria. It was something more insidious. Under the microscope, their blood samples showed the presence of alien cells, small, metallic-looking organisms that moved with purpose, latching onto human cells and replicating rapidly. They weren't killing the host, they were integrating, reshaping, rewriting. "It's not an infection," Hassan said, staring at the screen in horror. "It's assimilation. It's turning us into them." As they worked, the symptoms progressed. Hassan began to scratch at his arms incessantly, his fingers carving bloody furrows into his skin. "The symbols," he muttered, his eyes glazed over. "They're inside me. I can see them." At first, Lila thought he was delirious, but then she saw what he meant. Faint glyphs had started to form on his skin, the same alien symbols they'd seen in the tomb. They weren't just appearing. They were moving, shifting, as though alive. "Hassan, stop!" she cried, grabbing his hands to keep him from clawing at himself. "You're making it worse." "They want me to understand," he whispered, his voice unnervingly calm. "They're showing me what they are." He pulled away from her grasp and stumbled toward the artifact, which still sat on the lab bench. Its pulsating glow seemed to intensify as he approached, casting eerie shadows across the room. "Hassan, don't!" Tess shouted, but he didn't stop. "They're not trying to hurt us," he said, his voice almost reverent. "They're trying to make us better. To evolve us." Before anyone could stop him, Hassan reached out and placed both hands on the artifact. The room filled with a blinding light, and Lila and Tess were thrown back as a wave of heat and sound erupted from the object. When the light faded, Hassan was gone. What just happened?" Tess stammered, her voice shaking. Lila's mind raced as she stared at the artifact. It had consumed him, taken him somehow. But why? What was it doing? A deep, resonating hum filled the room, and the walls of the base seemed to vibrate with the sound. Lila's gaze snapped to the vent where the creature had disappeared earlier. The growls had stopped, replaced by a new sound, a wet, slithering noise that sent chills down her spine. "It's spreading," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just inside us. It's in the base. It's in everything." Tess grabbed her arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do? How do we stop this?" Lila looked at the artifact, its glow pulsating faster now, and felt a sinking dread settle over her. There was only one answer, but it was one she didn't want to face. "We go back to the tomb," she said. "Whatever this thing is, it started there, and that's where we'll end it." The slithering sound grew louder, closer. The base's lights flickered, casting the room into intermittent darkness. Lila took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "We don't have much time." The wind howled over the barren Martian desert as Lila Mandari stared into the jagged maw of the tomb's entrance. The artifact pulsed faintly in her pack, its rhythmic glow dimming and intensifying like the slow, steady heartbeat of something ancient and alive. She clutched it tightly, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. Behind her, Tess stood hunched over, her breathing labored. The infection had taken hold, and Lila could see the black veins creeping up Tess's neck, the skin beneath her suit bulging unnaturally in places. "We have one shot," Lila said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We get this thing back inside and destroy it. Everything. The artifact, the tomb, whatever it's connected to." "And us," Tess replied, her voice weak. She winced as one of the nodules beneath her skin pulsated violently, and a faint trickle of blood seeped from her nose. "This thing, it's not going to let us leave, is it?" Lila didn't answer. They both knew the truth. The organism had infected them all, reshaped their bodies, invaded their minds. Even now she could feel it spreading inside her, a cold, insidious presence worming its way into her thoughts. The tomb loomed before them, silent and foreboding. The walls glistened faintly in the red twilight, and the faint hum that had haunted them for days seemed to grow louder as they approached. Lila tightened her grip on the artifact, feeling its unnatural warmth seep through her gloves. "Let's finish this," she said. They descended into the tomb, the narrow corridor swallowing them in darkness. Their floodlights barely cut through the gloom, the shadows clinging to the walls like living things. The glyphs glowed faintly, their patterns shifting as though aware of their presence. The walls throbbed with a sickening vitality, veins of light pulsating in time with the artifact's glow. As they reached the central chamber, the hum reached a deafening crescendo. The artifact in Lila's pack seemed to resonate with the tomb itself, the glow intensifying until the entire room was bathed in a sickly, pulsating light. The air was thick with heat and the stench of decay, and Lila's stomach churned as she stepped forward. The chamber had changed since their first visit. The walls, once solid and metallic, now writhed like living flesh, veins and sinew threading through the structure. The pedestal at the center pulsed like a heartbeat, and above it, A mass of flesh and bone hung suspended, twisting and writhing as though in agony. It was the source of the organism, the hive mind that controlled everything, the infection, the creature, the tomb. Lila set the artifact on the pedestal, her hands shaking. The hum grew louder, a deafening roar that vibrated in her chest. The glyphs on the walls burned brighter, their shapes shifting faster, forming patterns that seemed to burrow into her mind. She stumbled, clutching her head as a wave of nausea and vertigo washed over her. "They know we're here," Tess said, her voice barely audible over the roar. She staggered to the wall, her breathing ragged. "It's fighting back." The chamber trembled, and the walls began to close in, the fleshy surface constricting around them. From the shadows, the creature emerged. It had grown, its form a grotesque amalgamation of limbs, bone, and sinew. Its glowing, hollow eyes locked onto Lila, and it let out a piercing shriek that echoed through the chamber. "Tess!" Lila shouted, her voice hoarse. "Get to the detonator." Tess nodded weakly, dragging herself toward the charges they had planted along the chamber walls. The creature lunged, its claws slashing through the air, but Lila stepped forward, drawing its attention. She raised a flare gun, the only weapon she had, and fired. The flare struck the creature's chest, igniting its flesh in a burst of light and flame. It screeched, rearing back, but it didn't stop. "Come on!" Lila screamed, backing away as the creature charged again. She fired another flare, but it barely slowed the monstrosity. It was faster now, more aggressive, as though it knew this was the final confrontation. Tess reached the detonator, her trembling hands struggling to activate it. Blood trickled from her ears and eyes, and her breathing was shallow. "I'll hold it off," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You need to get out." "No," Lila shouted, but Tess shook her head. "There's no time," Tess said, a faint smile on her bloodied lips. "You'll finish this. For all of us." Before Lila could protest, Tess slammed the detonator. The charges detonated in a chain reaction, the walls erupting in flames and debris. The chamber shook violently, the ceiling collapsing as the flesh-like walls burned, releasing an acrid, sulfuric stench. The creature let out a final, agonized shriek before it was consumed by the flames. Lila was thrown backward, her helmet cracking against the ground. She struggled to her feet, coughing as smoke and dust filled the air. The artifact was gone, vaporized in the explosion, but the tomb still stood, its walls writhing and pulsating with unnatural life. She stumbled toward the exit, her vision blurring. The infection raged inside her, the black veins spreading across her skin, but she pushed forward. Behind her, the tomb began to collapse, the fleshy walls crumbling into ash and dust. As she emerged onto the surface, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. The tomb was silent now, its hum finally extinguished. Lila collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. Her suit was torn, her body broken, but she was alive. For now. But as she looked down at her hands, she saw the black veins spreading faster now, the infection consuming her. She knew she didn't have much time. The tomb was destroyed, the organism seemingly eradicated, but the cost had been too high. She activated her distress beacon, the signal flashing weakly in the thin Martian atmosphere. Above her, the sky was a deep, endless red, the stars glimmering faintly in the distance. She wondered if rescue would come, or if she would be another casualty of the tomb's curse. And then, in the silence, she heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible. A low, resonating hum emanating from deep beneath the surface. It wasn't over. It had only just begun.